Do you trust your politicians, the people you voted for, who represent you, who take decisions on your behalf on important things like education, healthcare, national defense, and very importantly, how your taxes are being spent? Research is showing that trust in politicians is at an all-time low across most liberal democracies. In fact, only 1 in 5 citizens trusts politicians.
There is certainly a moment when the voter or young people that are listening right now, once you don't feel like your vote has influence, once you start thinking that your vote might not matter or serve you or your community, that's a very dangerous time. The moment the vote feels like it loses power, whether that's accurate or just the appearance of our votes not mattering. Do you see that as well?
Oh, it's definitely the case. There's no question about that. But perhaps it would be worth our time if we ask why. Why does that happen, right? And I think it goes back to the design of a political system. Okay, so if you allow me just a couple of minutes to explain what I'm saying, I think that it will come out. We'll understand a lot more. So our political system is called liberal democracy. It was something that emerged out of the philosophies of the European Enlightenment, essentially, and the French Revolution and the American Revolution afterwards. But the big idea that emerged at that time, the big idea that changed everything, is this idea of natural rights. Okay? And natural rights in the Enlightenment era means what it means today, that you have a certain innate rights as a human being, simply by virtue of being born a human being. Okay? Now that may sound completely sensible and reasonable to us today, and it does, but it was very revolutionary back in the 18th, 19th centuries. Okay? Now, if you think about it a little bit, you'll see that there's a problem between democracy and rights. Okay? And I'll explain why. So in a democracy, if we have pure democracy, like the ancient Greeks had, where all the people came together and they took a vote and they decided as a people about what to do, then what you have there is the possibility that majority will be a tyranny. Okay, it's called the tyranny of the majority. Just to give you an example, if 80% are white and 20% are blacks, maybe the 80% being the majority will decide that to take rights away from the 20% that are black. Okay, and that's the big problem of democracy. And those people back in the 18th century, they knew that because they knew political history, they knew what happened in ancient Greece and elsewhere. So they designed a system that prevents democracy, okay, from happening in order to safeguard rights. And that's the political system that we got. So in a nutshell, the political system that we have is a little bit of a monarchy, a little bit of a aristocracy, and a little bit of democracy mixed into one thing. So for example, you have say in Canada, the Prime Minister, in the United States, the President. And for a certain fixed time, the term, they're like a little monarch. Okay, they have huge authorities. They can do whatever they like, especially in America and in France, where the President is like a little emperor, at least for 4 or 5 years. Okay, and that's a little bit of monarchy, if you like. Then you have a little bit of aristocracy, and that is expressed through parliaments and through congresses, right? So, as you know, the evolution of congresses and parliaments comes from the landed gentry, the real aristocrats, and then over the years, especially in the 20th century, we have, everybody has equal vote, but essentially it means the same thing. We vote for what we think are the best of us to take care of business while we don't participate in anything, okay? And you have a little dose of democracy at the end, okay? And that little democracy is when you vote. I'm coming back to your question, right? And that little democracy happens like one day every 4 years, all right? So in one day every 4 years, we are allowed to say who we want to rule us for the next 4 years. And that's the democratic system that we live in, okay? So so that's why people feel frustrated, and young people feel frustrated. They feel, okay, wait a minute, I care about my society a lot more, right? And I don't want, to just have a vote every 4 years and then go back to sleep. But I'll tell you what, Takis, the design of the liberal democracy requires people, citizens, to go and vote and then enter a zombie state for 4 years. And I think that's where the big problem is right now, because the zombies have awakened.
It's very almost uncomfortable to say that there's a dash of democracy, just implying that a very small portion is genuine democracy almost feels uncomfortable when you hear it. And I've always felt fundamentally when electing a politician, there's the concern of human nature and self-preservation baked in that we don't talk about. So the politician, goal number 1, get elected. Goal number 2, get reelected. Goal number 3, provide for the family or the immediate community. And goal 4 or 5, maybe if you're lucky, is the wider community and the actual voter. So is there almost just our human nature of one individual looking out for self-preservation, almost a fundamental issue that is undeniable in terms of electing leaders that are inevitably going to care about keeping their job, getting their job, keeping their job, making sure their family are fed. And then somewhere down the line, those voters will try to make sure they're okay for the next run. Is there a human nature, just the fact that a human is our leader is always going to lead to these selfish problems that are unavoidable?
So let me first say that no political system is perfect. And I need to emphasize that very much. And if you look at history, when people thought that they had the perfect political system, it all ends up in blood and tears and concentration camps and and killing fields. Okay, so I think first of all we should set ourselves up to live with a little bit of imperfection and make some choices. So there are many positives in having people representing us and taking decisions for us over a set period of time, as long as there are checks and balances, as long as there's some transparency, as long as there's a way, for example, to influence those decisions by speaking to your representative or by lobbying your representative. So there are ways where citizens can interact with the political system. Absolutely, I'm not suggesting that there are none. I'm just saying that the system is set up so that the decisions are not taken by the citizens. The decisions are taken by our representatives. So that's the deal we have here. And of course, we can discuss whether we change it or not. That's a different discussion. But that's the deal we have here. Now, the political scientists have identified for a long time what you're describing, which in scientific terms is called the principal-agent problem, right? So we are the principals, and our representatives are our agents. We trust them with making sure that all our interests are being taken care of, okay? Now, as long as their interests and our interests are aligned, then we can trust our agents, okay? But when they're misaligned, then we have an issue, then we have a problem, right? Imagine, for example, you hire a lawyer to get you out of trouble, okay? You're the principal, he's your agent. Now, if they're a good lawyer, they say, okay, I'll get Takis out of trouble, right? I'll just charge him $1,000 and get him out of trouble. But usually what happens, a lawyer has to feed their family and they think, okay, maybe I'll get Takis out of trouble in a slow kind of way, and maybe I'll charge him more than $1,000 to get him out of that. So you see what I mean? There's always a misalignment between principals and agents. And that's a huge problem of representational democracy.
That's a really good point. The alignment, trying to get the alignment as close as possible. It is never going to be directly aligned. Most likely, I felt like I'm also far too young for people to really take me seriously in this. But for me, a historic moment in my 26-year-old life was 2008. That marked a really big shift for me, being a kid in high school and looking at politicians and having a great deal of belief, and there was power and prestige and they're looking up for us. And then in 2008, whether it was shortly after the documentaries and the books I had read, that felt like a very uncomfortable moment in time, of the most blatant, at least publicly for North Americans, of politicians looking out for the corporations and the 7-figure salaries and bailing people out. I am sure that a lot of that was necessary for the average person, but does 2008 mark kind of a historic shift in your life or in history, or just because I'm young, that's my only barometer for a jarring change?
I think I agree with you. And, the fact that you're young is an asset, and so you can look at it as a liability, okay? you have better eyes and a better mind to judge things than older people. So, I should be listening. I should be interviewing and listening to you, Takis, rather than the other way around. But anyway, since you've asked me for this interview, I'll go with it. So I agree with you. Yeah, 2008 was a watershed moment, definitely, because it exposed the nakedness of the system to many people that they were kind of trusting the system to take them on. And of course, it had to do with the financial crisis and had to do with who pays the bill, right? And how private bets were socialized and how the governments and our politicians were implicit in this socialization of private bets, meaning, some bankers took some bad bets and then the taxpayer needs to bail them out, okay? And that felt really bad. And that, I think, kicked off this huge wave of populism, both in North America and in Europe. I think behind this story, there are at least two important stories that drive this discontent, okay, I would say. One is that it seems, and there's data to back it up, that our representational system of government is sold off to the powers to be, to those who have money, simply because of that lobbying that takes place, simply of that sort of relationship, very close relationship with government and big money, essentially, right? So there's an obvious power asymmetry between common citizens, which is everybody, us, and big corporations who can influence more what policies take place. So this is one big thing, one big truth. And when Trump went around and said, I'm gonna what is it, dry the swamp? What is it? Something like that.
Drain the swamp.
Drain the swamp. Okay, it resonated very strongly with a lot of people. Okay, in Europe as well. Okay, the second thing has to do with, I think, with the economy, right? And I think the United States is worse off than any other country that I know in the West when it comes to big divisions within people, right, within populations. But I'll generalize across the West right now. So the economy works for very few people, but doesn't work for most people. Okay, and everybody understands that. My parents, probably your parents, your grandparents, were looking forward to you or me, like I do for my child, for the next generation to be even better off than the previous one, and so on and so forth. And now clearly that's not the case. And if you think also about how technology is impacting work and the prospects of work for many people, not just young people who don't happen to have a college degree, but even young people that do have a college degree. Okay, there's an obvious conclusion, right? That things do not work for everybody the way they are, and something needs to change. Now, I don't think right now there has been a very solid proposition. What does that mean? What does change actually mean? I mean, there's lots of things flying around. Like, for example, the green economy. Yes, that sounds good, and I think it's necessary. I mean, we do need to save the planet. But does that mean that we're going to have a more equitable economy? Not necessarily, right? Okay. People talking about UBI, and maybe we can talk a little bit about UBI, universal basic income. Okay, but how meaningful would that be? Right? Because if it's not meaningful, that means that everybody's going to be on welfare, right? That's what it means, and so everybody's going to be poor and on welfare. This is not a way to stabilize society. This is not going to solve any problems. This is indeed going to create even more problems. People work not just to get a paycheck. There's a lot of self-dignity involved there. There's other things, So it's not just waving a check for like $1,000 and think that the problem will be solved. So so I can stop waffling. I think these are the big problems that we have right now. We have a political system that is not transparent and is not inclusive, and it does not allow a direct communication with citizens on an ongoing basis. So it's an antiquated political system that I don't think, stands the test of modern technology and the modern world. So something needs to change there. And we have an economy that doesn't work for everybody. So something will inevitably break. Even if you do nothing, something will break. The fear that I have, and probably you and others, that it will break in the wrong direction. Okay? And that, I think, it's what worries many people, including myself.
I definitely want to cover AI and Andrew Yang and UBI in a few moments, but speaking on 2008, the typical argument you hear is that somebody that pays 8 figures in annual taxes deserves more influence on their dollar figure than someone who spends $8,000 annually. The discrepancy is so wide. Do you hear that argument? Do you understand bits of accuracy in that argument? If you're paying literally 7-8 figures in taxes, maybe having influence on where that sheer massive number goes is a worthy conversation, or your tax bracket doesn't affect, it's one vote, one influence, which is the ideal way. But a lot of people will argue 7-8 figures taxes, I gotta have a little bit of influence in where that goes.
Not at all. We should be all equal, whoever we are, whatever degrees we have, if none, and it doesn't matter how much tax you pay or how much money you pay. This is a fundamental principle for a democratic society to exist. Okay? If you take that principle away, then you're drifting away from a democratic society. You become, you go back, in fact, in the past, right? In the past, not so distant past, like until the early 20th century, for example, not everybody had the right to vote. Okay, the people who had the right to vote for parliament, let's say in England, were the people who had property, for instance, right? So the fact that we today live in political systems where everybody has equal rights is a victory gained by the people. So we should move forward beyond that point and forward rather than going back. So I'm not at all buying those arguments as well. Those arguments will only lead to further destabilization. Okay. And by the way, there's another problem in this argument as well. The problem in this argument is, how did you make your money? Okay. So there's two sources of making money. One is you just inherited. So you had a very smart ancestor, I guess, or someone stole the money for you. You don't have to steal it yourself. And you've inherited a huge fortune, right? So that doesn't mean anything. Okay. But someone might say, I made my money because I'm super smart. Okay, I invented something fantastic. I built a great app. I worked my bottom off in a garage, coding, and now I'm a billionaire, right? And therefore, because of this idea of meritocracy, I am better than you, who decided instead of building something to just play with your friends, go out and have a picnic or whatever, right? You lazy bum. Okay, so in that argument, I would say, okay, if you, my friend, the billionaire, made this money in a vacuum, like you went out to an asteroid, let's say, right, where no one inhabited there, and you set up shop there, you did it all by yourself with your own means, then I really, I'm going to tip my hat to you, right? But you didn't. You created what you created by living in a society that gave you the resources to advance yourself and realize yourself, and you became a billionaire, and that's fantastic, right? And you should enjoy you should enjoy your money, absolutely, right? But that doesn't give you the right, not for a moment, to have more of of importance when it comes to political decisions than the guy over there who just has no home. Okay, you have the equal rights. Okay. That's a prerequisite for people like you to be able to do the same things that you've done, the great things that you've done. Okay, so that's the argument against the audacity of meritocracy.
Totally with you on that. You actually brought up history a few times already in this short conversation, and I just had a historian on talking about World War I and World War II and the anti-war movement. And while he said we can learn so much from history, history leaves a blind spot in modern technology. So the wars of yesterday can't necessarily give us an accurate predictor on the wars of tomorrow because of the technology gap. So in terms of economics and democracy and voting, how much do you value learning from history versus the inevitable blind spot of AI and automation and all these things that years before couldn't even imagine? So I guess what balance do you have between using history to move forward, and also recognizing the blind spots history just couldn't foresee?
So I have a slight different view from that guest of yours. I think that although the world is changing and we're faced with new challenges and technology is progressing, creating new dilemmas and new opportunities and new threats, and that's obvious, there is something about human nature that doesn't change. Okay? And the key is to understand human nature as much as possible. Okay? And the only way to understand human nature is through the humanities, in fact. Okay, so I'm an engineer, but I've studied classics and the humanities and history a lot. You can't learn about people just by coding AI. Okay, you learn about human nature and how societies evolve and what decisions they make by looking at history, right? And then, of course, you need to understand human psychology and other things. That's what's going to teach you what human nature is, and that's what's going to help you predict what humans will do, for example, in the future, when they will have the capability of obliterating enemies, not even before a war starts, because they're going to have, I don't know, super intelligent AIs that can hack the opponent's system. We can think all kinds of crazy science fiction or less science fiction scenario about future wars, but human nature will be the same all the time. Okay, and that's why I think that history is a great teacher for the future.
When we start talking about AI, I find it very interesting, but I always feel like the biggest question and the biggest debate with AI is, does AI create more net jobs or does AI destroy more net jobs? My concern is it might destroy, but it's a very interesting debate. Both sides have some really good points. So I would ask you if you have a bold take. Does AI create or does it destroy jobs in 10, 20 years?
So I'll give you an answer in two ways, right? First, from the point of view of economics, okay, and what we know about economics so far. If a technology increases human productivity, then it will create new demand for labor and new demand for services, right? If a technology replaces humans, and that's all it does, then it doesn't have any dividends for society at large, okay? So if you look at, in the past of industrial revolutions, you will see that there's more jobs now than there were in the past, right? In the past, most people work in farms. Now it's just 2% working in farms. So what happened there, right? What happened there was that some technologies came in and replaced humans, all right? Okay. Now, if that was only what happened, then today we will have only 2% people employed and everybody else will be unemployed, okay? But that didn't happen. Why? Because those technologies, repurposed for different parts of the economy, advance human productivity in other fields. Okay, so people moved away from the farm where they were doing really terrible jobs, right, into more comfortable jobs that didn't have to break their backs in order to do, right? So they could produce more things by just going into an office and working for 6 hours rather than, toiling in the farm from dawn till dusk. Okay, so the big bet and the big question is AI replacing work? Is it automating existing human tasks? Or is it augmenting human tasks? Or is doing things that humans cannot do? Let me give you therefore an example, right? Because AI does both. My theory is that it does both of the former rather than the latter right now, okay? And there's reasons for that. So take, for example, AI that is capable of automating work tasks by, for example, understanding human text, okay, and summarizing human text. Okay, so there's a lot of work that's happening, mostly, let's say, paralegal professions, right, where some people have to read many pages of court decisions, wherever, and summarize them so they can give them to the solicitors or the lawyers to take to court, right? So all this work now can be done away because you can use AI to do it. So all those jobs are going to be gone, right? Those clerical jobs, okay? Does that make the lawyer more augmented? Okay, if it does, and I don't think it does, by the way, because it eliminates one job, but it doesn't make the lawyer more productive. It doesn't, because the lawyer was equally productive whether the human was going to do it. Okay, maybe a little bit better now, maybe, but still, there's no end result there. So we just have an elimination of work here. Okay, that's all we have. Okay, in this particular example, but not the creation of new work, not in any significant way, I would argue. Another example with AI that does something completely different is that it delivers something that humans cannot do. An example. DeepMind, which is a company, an AI company by Google, everybody knows that. A few months ago, if I'm not mistaken, on the time scale, it released a paper describing an AI system called AlphaFold. And what AlphaFold does is an AI system that predicts how proteins fold. Okay, so this is a really big problem in biology, and it takes a lot of computing power and a lot of time to predict how proteins fold, and it's very important to know how proteins fold because this is one of the bases of drug discovery. Okay, so there you have a system that can massively accelerate what we do in the pharmaceutical sector and life sciences. That is creating, quantum leaps in human productivity. That is an example of AI creating more demand for labor. Okay, so to cut a long story short, in my analysis, come to the conclusion. If we can direct AI systems in augmenting human productivity, in solving problems that humans cannot solve, then you will see huge benefits from AI. Some jobs will be displaced, but there'll be what is called the compensation effect. There will be creation of new jobs and well-paid jobs. Okay. If you have AI simply replacing tasks so that companies can simply reduce their costs, but not really increase anything else, i.e. profitability or anything else, then what you got is just unemployment.
It's such a hard conversation for me to wrap my head around because of how fast things have gone. Like, I watched the AlphaGo documentary of it playing the game and how good it got game after game. It's kind of like short-term AI is 10 years and then mid, maybe 20 to 30. And then all of a sudden, it's very hard to predict how fast this grows and what it changes. And a lot of the concerns that you see online is that AI would take away the lowest level jobs, the manual jobs. But I've seen a counter argument that I thought was interesting, that it actually takes away the middle, where the highest positions will stay and manage, and the lowest, the manual labor, the people that are really doing physical work, are always going to be around. But eliminating that middle is almost scary and relatively dangerous. So do you see both those arguments, that step one, minimum wage jobs are gone, or step one is actually the middle jobs are going to leave and the entry level and the CEO, CFO, CMO are going to be just fine? Do you see the fear of the middle or the fear of the bottom?
You're absolutely right. This phenomenon is called the hollowing out of jobs, and is, as you describe it, like a U-shaped curve, right? Where you have, jobs at the high end, high level, high paid jobs being very many, one tip of the U, and another tip of the U, as you said, low level, low paid jobs, and nothing in between, right? No one is a prophet, but if history is a teacher, then we may be seeing the same thing, the hollowing out of jobs, and I think that's what's going to happen. Now, this has repercussions in politics as well, because what that translates in terms of society is that you have a collapse of the middle class. Okay, so the middle class means if you have a strong middle class in society, it means that economic inequality is not that big. It averages out. So you have, the super rich, then you have rich, but then you have a middle class somewhere in the middle, which is doing okay, and then you have the poor. If you don't have a middle class, and then you have a huge gap, you just have the poor, huge gap, super rich, right? This is a completely unstable political system. Aristotle, many thousand years ago, and his analysis it still holds. So reflected on that point, and he said, okay, inequality is something natural in society. Some people are more, they work harder than others, are smarter than others. Not everybody is the same, definitely not. But you can't have democracies where you have huge income inequalities. If you do, two things can happen. Either the very rich take over and suppress everybody else, So you have, for example, even today around the world, such sort of countries, essentially plutocracies. I mean, Russia is an example. Okay, there's no middle class in Russia to speak of. Everybody's very poor, and then you have the super rich oligarchs basically running the show and making themselves even richer. Okay, so that's an example. The other consequence of not having a middle class, having that U-shaped curve, okay, is that the people rebel. Okay, there's a revolution of the people. Okay, and usually what that means is that there's a populist leader that leads that revolution. So the democracy slides down to a tyranny. Okay, and again, if you look at the 1930s in Germany or in Italy, the fascists and the Nazis were popular movements. Okay, they were voted by the people and they were led by Mussolini and Hitler, and we all know how that ended. Okay, so it's very important that we don't have those huge income inequalities in society, and we do have a stable and thriving middle class for democracy to survive.
So I want to shift to UBI, and in my case, and probably a lot of young people, Andrew Yang popularized this. Andrew Yang kind of made this conversation widespread amongst 20-somethings. And in my view, while I really like Andrew Yang, there's two elements. We talked a lot about human nature, and short term, I don't feel super comfortable with UBI because of human nature. But long term, with automation and with genuine AI, it seems almost inevitable. So first of all, I guess we should start with your thoughts on UBI and if there's a distinction between current version of UBI working in 2021, 2030, or if in 2050 this idea makes a lot more sense. Let's get right into the Andrew Yang UBI combo.
So, thanks. I'll tell you. I'll be honest with you. I've changed my mind a few times about UBI. Okay, but I'm going to tell you how my mind is shaped right now. Okay, so I'm in fact settled on being in favor of UBI. Okay, not in all its various versions, and there's lots of caveats, and we can discuss that. But I think that there are two reasons, political reasons, why we should think how to execute AI in a good way, right? Okay, there's two reasons. One reason is that the reason I gave you before, we can't have so much income inequality, right? It just cannot happen anymore, and we really need to change that. And the only way to change that, in a sensible way, is to have some kind of redistribution and transfers. There's no other way, really, because there's such a huge gap. Okay, so the government needs to play a role here. Let's call it that way. It has to do with the role of government. The second reason is the huge opportunity about AI, Taki, is that it can lead us to a world of economic abundance. Okay, now this is a huge statement to make. So let me explain what that means. Think of AI systems again in the context that I mentioned before, that augment human capabilities, right? Like the AlphaFold, for example, right? That can help us design new drugs. Okay. Similar AI systems can help us design new materials, perhaps materials that can transform solar energy into electric energy with 100% or near 100% efficiency, right? They can help us simulate, all kinds of chemical reactions, create new ways of putting chemicals together, which means that we can completely revolutionize how we produce food, how produce manufacture materials, how we do everything, right? At a lower energy cost. Okay, so the reason why we have scarcity in the world today is because to produce anything, it requires a high energy cost. Okay, and it has impact on the environment. AI can help us reduce that energy cost massively, which means we can enter a world where we wouldn't have to worry about making ends meet, and that will include everybody on the planet. Okay, in that world, we have to remember how our ancestors used to live before the agricultural revolution, right? So, 10,000 years ago, people like you and me didn't do any work, okay? And they haven't been doing any work since the dawn of the human species, which was like 200,000 years ago, right? And they were very happy, very healthy, living meaningful lives. So we need to rediscover what that means, okay, in this world of abundance. So UBI can help us, okay, if we can think about it in the proper terms, and maybe we can think about talk about what that means. it can help us sustain a very meaningful life, a very creative life in that world of abundance. Okay, so those are the two reasons why I've started taking UBI seriously. And the only kind of like difference perhaps I have with many others is that I don't think UBI should be provided by the government alone. Okay, we must find new ways of income in that world where data and AI algorithms run most of the economy. And there are ways like that. In fact, I'm describing some in my book that I think are good ways of providing that income. So not just the government by redistributing through taxation, let's say, or borrowing, but through the value creation that our data and algorithms will be making in that new economy of the 21st century.
So I'm all in on UBI. I believe it's inevitable in the future. My only concerns when I said human nature kind of goes back to one of my early questions about the human nature of a politician, meaning if, Andrew Yang comes out and says $1,000 a month and he wins, right now, I think there's a vote in New York City for his mayor campaign. Let's say you win for $1,000 a month, that gets approved. 4 years down the line, we're going to do $1,200 a month. Now it's $2,000. My only concern has nothing to do with the people, and I love UBI. It sounds like a beautiful way to move forward. But at what point do politicians say, I want to get elected, I want to get reelected, I want to keep my job, I want to provide for my family, so that number keeps going up until things become unsustainable, and then the wealthiest start getting more frustrated, and it just becomes a who can promise more money conversation. Is that even a fair concern, or is that an irrational concern that the human nature of politicians, and probably my distrust for politicians, is my only concern when it comes to UBI, not the people that would benefit day to day?
So you're absolutely right, Agus. You see, this problem about human nature is what tormented those thinkers back in the Enlightenment, where they were trying to design a political system that took into account human nature. And that's why we have all those checks and balances, if you like, right? The separation of powers, legislators, the executive, the courts, etc., etc. So it's to manage a society where human nature is complex, right? We are we are essentially creatures that like to collaborate, I would say. Okay, we also like to compete. Sometimes we compete, sometimes collaborate. Many times we're completely altruistic, and sometimes we're very selfish. And it all depends on how the game in front of us is set up. Okay, so just to give you an example, I was in London during lockdown last year at the beginning, and before that I used to go to the supermarket. Okay, and everybody would be polite. I would walk into the supermarket and buy, take whatever I wanted, put in my basket, walk out. Fantastic. And then when lockdown came, suddenly there was this rumor that there wasn't enough food to go around. Okay, it's just a rumor, right? And that changed human behavior completely. Okay, so exactly the same humans behaving in one way one day and another way the other day. So why am I saying all this? It's because your question is all about human nature, and we need to think of the future based on the lessons that we know from the past. How can we ensure, right, first of all, that politicians stay honest to what citizens want? How can we ensure a more inclusive democratic system? That's number two. And number three is, how do we ensure that the big lobbies and the very powerful people don't have more say than us in policy making? Because if we don't, what you'll end up having is what I've said in the beginning: everybody being on welfare and living, at minimum income, while the rich are traveling in space, right? Having a good time going to the moon and Mars and whatnot.
It's funny. I was in Toronto during the first wave of lockdowns, and I had a very similar experience of a grocery mission 7 days prior that was very peaceful. There's old ladies with their carts. 7 days later, you could cut the tension with a knife, and you see people on edge packing their carts. It's very rapid, that 7-day shift, and it was very strange to see with the uncertainty. But I guess another argument with UBI would be that it would stifle innovation, or it would stifle the startup, the hungry Silicon Valley guy that wants to build an app that's great for humanity, or wants to build a software, wants to be a part of the AI movement that says, wait, 50% of my profits if I start up this successful company are going to this? Or is there any accuracy to that? Personally, I think as like a young, creative, ambitious young man, I don't think everyone else having $1,000 a month would change my mission in any capacity. But do you see this argument that, oh, well, the innovators aren't going to innovate, business is going to flee the US? Is there any truth to that, and is it a valid concern?
I think if that was true, you would never see the son or the daughter of a rich person doing anything in their lives, right? And although you do see that occasionally, of course, it's often the case that children of well-off families that wouldn't have to do anything, just eat, just spend mommy and daddy's money, they make successful companies. And I think that it's up to people what they want to do with their lives, regardless of how much backing they have. Indeed, the opposite is true. I think there's many talented people out there that didn't have the right means in order to realize their dreams, because they had to break their backs doing shitty jobs when they had so much potential to do more. And if we help those people, if UBI could help those people realize their dreams, we're all better off. Okay, so instead of having 5 unicorns, right? Okay, paying 50% of their profits to be redistributed among 1 million people, you have 10,000 unicorns. Okay, because you just raised from poverty, 9,910 people. I don't know, whatever. I do the maths. Okay, so I think this is a huge opportunity for society, definitely. I mean, of course, there'll be people that say, okay, $1,000 is enough for me, I can get my cigarettes, my beer, I'm cool, right? And that's fine, and that's fine, absolutely fine, okay? But I think it will be more meaningful to people who say, okay, now that I've got $1,000, I don't have to worry about my bills, I'm gonna put it together and create something fantastic, right? And it's those people that will make the huge difference, and those people don't make it today.
That's a really actually a beautiful point, and one that I haven't heard before, because I've always heard the jokes of the greatest basketball player ever never made the NBA because his family couldn't afford basketball, or the greatest artist in the world never had music lessons and had to work at a gas station, and we never heard the greatest artist. And in a more important way, the greatest potential inventor. What if there is somebody that has a medicine or even just literature in general? That's a really, really important point that I actually didn't take into account. The amount of people that don't even get the opportunity to contribute to the economy. They don't even get the opportunity to showcase their brilliance because survival is so dire. And that's a really beautiful point. I want to thank you for that.
And I think it's true. You see, if you ask anyone who started a business, the biggest problem was how they're going to survive, X number of months until they get their first revenue or first funding, right? And for many people, that was prohibitive, right? Especially if you happen to have like a family, right? Have a kid or something, right? You have to think of the child first, right? So that dynamic would change completely if you just had by default, let's say $1,500, you could keep the child fed, and then you can go away and spend 6 months building something that may have the potential to create jobs and create new opportunities for others. So I think that's, again, we discussed that, but again, I think that's the huge opportunity here, right? How you can create a sort of exponential dynamics in society, so that human knowledge, the human capacity for creativity, right, can be harnessed and be fed back for the betterment of everybody. Okay, and that's not by any means, a socialist perspective, right? This is very much about free market. Okay, but free market with human beings in the center, right? We can't think that markets will solve everything. They will not solve everything. They provingly do not solve everything. I think it's humanism and human values and social values that should guide markets in order to have the outcomes that we require. So how we blend the two, I think, is really important.
So wrapping up, we covered kind of the darkest parts of society: distrust, inequality, the concern of AI removing jobs, and we talked about some really bright opportunities with UBI and AI actually creating the opportunity for so many people that haven't had opportunity in the past 100+ years. But as a final question, knowing human nature, because we talked about the darkness and the brightness, but human nature lingers in the middle, are you hopeful or concerned about the future 100 years from now? You and I are long gone. On an honest level, putting in the great technologies and the great concerns, are you hopeful or are you deeply concerned about the year 3021?
So I'm very hopeful, Takis, and I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. Human beings had the ample opportunity to blow themselves up in the 1950s and 1960s, right? I was a child in the 1970s, and I remember, doing drilling exercises for nuclear attacks, right? It was part of the our normal lives to survive the nuclear holocaust, right? Okay, unimaginable perhaps for you, and thankfully it's unimaginable. But that was the state of the world at that time. The fact that we are still around today says a lot about the human instinct for self-preservation, and I think I'm gonna bet on that. Right, I'm gonna bet on the human instinct of self-preservation to save humanity from madness. Okay, now on top of that, however, I'm also optimistic because we are all connected now in the world, right? I mean, I don't know how you found me and how I found you, but we wouldn't have found each other like 10 years and 15 years ago, right? And the fact that we found each other and you have found other people, that creates a unique opportunity to bring minds together and think of new things, okay? And that is an amazing opportunity for humanity, okay? And going back to technology, for example, right? I'm personally involved with people that are building what is called now the Web 3.0, okay? Which in a nutshell means, how can we shift power back to the users, essentially, back to you and me, right? Who are using applications. How can we shift power back? And that is very important, going back to the UBI conversation that we had, right? Because there's an opportunity if we could shift that power back to people, through digital identities, data wallets, data sovereignty, etc., then we can create income for ourselves simply by virtue of interacting with digital systems and digital platforms. So this is a great opportunity for humanity. And on top of that, we can build, applications, and we can build new opportunities so all those things fill me with hope. Okay, and especially, people like you, like young people. I see my son is younger than you. He's 12 years old, right? And he plays video games all the time. But that's great because, being able to understand, human nature, the lessons that he learns from video games in just one session. It took me 15 years to learn by playing football, right? I tell you, right? on the gravel ground. So yes, I'm an optimist for all those reasons, right? For all those reasons, I remain optimist, and I think humankind will be around for many centuries to come.